I'll start out with Justina giving an overview of what we looked at last time.
Thank you. So last time we met, we talked about the historical context for Salt Lake City, and especially about the redlining, how it affected the city and its lasting legacy that even today affects the income and racial distribution in the city. We established some key economic facts like median household income and the fact that about 60% of the city residents qualify as low income according to the HUD income limits. We also talk about the fast-growing population and how it affects housing prices in the city. As a reminder, on this slide, we show eviction rates that largely align with the areas that were historically redlined. Also, we remind ourselves that the state has an affordable housing shortage of approximately 45,000 units, and that the number for Salt Lake City is about 7,500 units. If we can move to the next slide. So at this stage of our project, we looked at what the city is currently doing to mitigate effects of displacement, to preserve existing affordable housing and produce enough new affordable housing in the future. We have looked at a long list of documents that were prepared over the past several years. We'll list them here, and in a minute, we'll give you some time to look at it and comment on whether we've covered all of the crucial documents. But if we can move to the next slide for now. So as I said a minute ago, we looked through the documents that we listed on the previous slide, and we organized the policies, ordinances, and various measures that the documents describe along a time continuum. We try to arrange them in such a way as to show which ones offer immediate remedies and which ones are designed to create mid and long-term results. We also divided them into actions that are currently in place and those that are being planned. We also divided them into, in the next and last stage of our project, we will look at best practices and case studies to establish what measures have proven successful and might be considered by the city in the future. On the next slide, I put both the list of the documents and the measures that we've pulled out of these documents on one slide. And now we would appreciate you taking a few minutes to look at both of the slides and answer two questions in the chat. Which one of these reports you consider the most important from the perspective of mitigating displacement? And which reports, policies, or ordinances might be missing from our list, but definitely should be included? So now, please, if you would like to go to the chat and just put down what comes to your mind when you look at these two.
Yeah, I see some of them have been put, like Francisca put the, it's a multicultural Utah, a report on evictions that we should probably look at. Thanks, Francisca.
Well, and I would like to add that the report that was done by Dr. Joel Arvizo Zavala looked at eviction rates, I think a 6-month period for 2019 and 2020. And their research team also looked at distribution of rental assistance, and they used the census data to identify zip codes with high BIPOC populations, and surprise, surprise, you know, the most diverse zip codes in our state had the highest number of evictions and the lowest number of rental applications. So it's the second link, it's a dashboard that they created. It is very, very interesting.
Yeah, again, thanks for sharing those. We will look at them more carefully.
Also, as we said, we'll be moving on. However, we'll send the link to this presentation. And if you find some time just to go back, maybe think a bit about it a little more and just give us comments, that would be great. The document I looked at specifically was Growing Salt Lake City, a 5-year housing plan. And it proposed several policies and ordinances targeted at mitigating displacement, stimulating the production of affordable housing, as well as promoting home ownership. And some of them were really, really interesting, and I thought had large potential. The one that spoke to me personally was infill ordinance. But as the year 2022 is approaching really fast, we would like to ask you to take a minute to respond in chat to the following question. As I said, it doesn't really have to be in the chat, but we're putting the questions out there. So if you, there isn't much time to think about it in detail now, but if you would spare a minute later and just go back to the document and provide us with comments, we would really greatly appreciate it. So the question we have here is, which measures proposed in this document have been implemented, and to what extent the implementation followed the plan?
Okay, so I looked at the transit station area development guidelines, which are based on an incentive system that give developers the opportunity to pass through quick administrative review, saving the developer any costs associated with a longer approval process involving public hearings. There's also the potential for the waiving of some design requirements, such as increasing building height. The goals of the guidelines that are associated with affordable housing are in the production of mixed income housing, which incorporate a certain percentage of affordable housing units, and also building those units within high opportunity zones as defined by the Utah Housing Corporation's Opportunity Index map. However, there is very little overlap between TSA zones and areas with a score of three or higher, which is required for points to be given. Some of the setbacks of these guidelines is that they are entirely voluntary, and that the potential impact on overall production is small simply because the amount of land zoned for TSA is minimal. Some questions that I have for you all are, could we provide a similar incentive system to other zones? Could we extend the TSA zone to cover all areas along the tracks? And do these incentives truly function as incentives for change? Or do they function as perks for developers who already had incorporated these elements into their designs? And then is expedited approval and the waiving of certain design requirements enough of an incentive? In the next slide, we can see the TSA zones that are in blue, circled in red. And as we can see, it's not much land in the city is zoned for TSA. In the next slide, I also looked at off-street parking requirements. Currently, the minimum parking required for many zones is higher than what is needed. This especially affects residential buildings in needing to construct expensive parking that in turn increases the rent prices for residents. The ordinance does have an exception for residential buildings with a certain percentage of affordable housing units. So these buildings can reduce their minimums to bring down the cost and price for those units. Also, the city currently has a proposal to reduce these minimums in several zones and for several uses, especially in high density and more transit oriented areas. And in bringing down parking minimums, it also provides more opportunity for unbundled rent and parking, which also brings rent prices down. So they're working on that. But a question that I have for you is, are there plans to expand on-street residential permit parking to help with some of the increased demand for on-street parking that follows from reduced off-street parking? I know we're trying to be more transit oriented, but we're not there yet. And then I also have a question, is the proposed off-street parking revision expected to be approved and implemented? And that's what I have.
All right, so my documents go over the multiple different versions of housing that don't require large multifamily builds. So in essence, we're talking about the missing middle, which is anything from a step up from a single family home into right before like a 4 or 5 story multifamily building. And so the first text was the low density multifamily residential. And the general goal was to remove zoning barriers to increase the diversity of housing types for all income levels throughout the city. These types of builds work great for infill, and with a limited number of units, they encourage compatibility with the existing builds around them. So if you're coming into a neighborhood with single family homes and it perhaps there's a single family home there that could use some extra love, and it's purchased, and instead a duplex, triplex, or one of these small cottage apartments goes up instead, it still fits in with the character of the neighborhood. The text also reduces the lot requirement, so you can fit 3 units instead of 2 for, I believe, a 6,000 square foot lot. And then my question was, I am not a wizard of Salt Lake, I'm not an omnipotent Salt Lake home ownership housing person, so I don't know how many of these are actually going up around the city. It doesn't seem like it would be the most profit incentivized for developers. They're more likely to land bank, build a big unit, and get the money from all the units. So I would love to hear what people in the chat have to say about that. Next slide. We go into State House Bill 82, which is about the ADU ordinance. Long story short, this bill defines where ADUs are allowed, and also a lot of opposition to it was because of the fear of short-term rentals like VRBO and Airbnbs coming in and more negatively impacting the already available affordable housing in an area. And so this sets up the ability to punish individuals who list these ADUs for a short-term rental. And it also reigns supreme over HOAs who are trying to prohibit builds. So if a homeowner in an HOA neighborhood wants to build one, the HOA is like, heck no, we can go to the House Bill 82 and it gives you the permission to do that. It also mentions the Olene Walker pilot program, which I have looked into, and it requires that there is a 2-year pilot program for funding for ADUs in this House bill. On Olene Walker's website, I couldn't find anything about that. So if anyone again in the chat has any information on that program, I would love to hear about it. Maybe one of you in the professional field has had more hands-on with that. And then next slide. Going off the House bill, Salt Lake has a building ADU accessory guide PDF. It's kind of a who, what, when, where, how, why of any interested homeowner, what they would like to build. Currently, you can only build an ADU on a property that has a single family home, so no duplexes or triplexes, and it has to be an owner occupied lot. And so if you have a landlord that owns multiple properties, it can only go up on the one that they are currently living on. We have permitted versus conditional areas, which we'll see in a next slide when we get there. But currently, all applications in the conditional areas have been approved. And so one of the questions we had was whether or not the conditional was really serving a purpose, or if it was just adding extra hoops and extra expense to the permitting process for these. Future actions, numerical yearly targets. We all know that we have not seen a lot of new ADUs being built. Currently in the ADU annual report, it says that we are only averaging about 13 a year, which is actually quite a few more than we have. Alleviating zoning barriers, modifying the fees, funding a program to construction. As I said already, it's difficult to get how to funding. There's no mortgage payments really, or mortgage products, and then kind of having a rooms to go version. So in a way, you come in, you have a menu of ADUs you like, you pick the one that you like, it's already been approved by the city, and you pick it up and you put it in, which is great. Next slide. This one, Justina is going to jump in on really quick, but to go over really fast, the dark green area is the permitted use. This is a map of Salt Lake, and the light green is the conditional areas.
So basically, this map is taken straight from the ADU handbook, and what it shows is areas where the city, where the areas of the city where the ADUs are actually allowed. First of all, I sort of had an impression when we talked about ADUs a long time ago, and I didn't have more details. I understood that anywhere in the city ADUs can be built, but this maps shows in more detail, as Valerie already mentioned, where they're permitted as permitted use, where they can build as permitted, outright permitted use, and where they are conditional use. But more importantly, most of the city, they can be built in most of the city, and in historic district, they require a certificate of appropriateness, which makes the process, you know, sort of cumbersome and difficult, and might actually scare a lot of people. So this is just showing that ADUs, even though we tend to talk about ADUs are as being allowed anywhere in the city, they actually are not that easy to build.
All right, thanks, Justina. This next map is just showing where we have applications come in. As you see, they are congregated around District 5, a little bit in District 7, but I was pretty surprised to see a few applications going up outside of it. Next slide. And then we get to the single room occupancy tax, which from here on out, I'll refer to as shared housing. They have changed the name. Single room occupancy is stigmatized as historically they're known as flop houses, or areas where maybe more vulnerable populations have lived, and it expands, this tax expands the number of zoning districts that shared housing is allowed in, although the writers agreed that they could continue to increase those areas to ensure equity citywide. It allows for weekly rentals and more leverage for owners who are renting them to enforce the rules. It, however, does not delineate between a short-term housing for vulnerable populations versus a dorm-style housing for adults. And so, of course, there is public opposition and concern over the former, people not wanting those who traditionally would not be able to find housing in the city to be in their neighborhood. Many requirements for affordable housing require a clean criminal record, and there are a lot of our vulnerable populations do not fit into that. And so these SROs, or shared housing programs, typically don't require a background check. So you're allowing those who would not traditionally be able to find housing an ability to find it, but you're also kind of increasing, perhaps maybe for the public, it feels a little bit more unsafe in that area. But then we also have looking at it like a dorm style housing. And so this image is of PodShare, which is affordable co-living in California. So it's allowing young professionals to live in urban city centers that would not traditionally be allowed, be able to afford living there. So what it does is it cuts down construction costs because you are sharing the most expensive rooms to build, such as kitchens and bathrooms. And through this, it is not taking funding from the pool of traditional housing units, which is another concern that we hear for affordable housing proponents in the city, is that they they don't want to feel like they're getting less than just to fill the gap. But these are not taking from traditional LIHTC housing. These are ways to build in where the construction costs are naturally mitigated.
All right, so now we're going to transition into talking about form-based codes and affordable housing overlays. Both of these concepts are fairly new to Salt Lake City. Form-based codes is a little bit older than affordable housing overlays. Salt Lake City's first form-based code was established in 2013 in the Central Ninth neighborhood. They have two separate types of codes. They have FBUN 1, which allows a maximum story height of 2, and FBUN 2, which allows a maximum story height of 4. Then after that, the second form-based code was established along the S-Line corridor within Sugar House. I think they are still trying to do a little bit more community engagement to educate the public on it and to try to establish more form-based codes throughout Salt Lake City. Transitioning on, affordable housing is much more newer than the form-based code within Salt Lake City. Currently, it is not a requirement. They are aiming for this particular overlay to provide incentives to developers to put it into their projects. And they're trying to accomplish that by having some zoning code modifications for these developers, like for them to be able to add on additional height or having reduced parking requirements or process waivers. And so they're still holding various community outreach events, and they're trying to do that through community engagement surveys and story maps. To the right, you'll find a project timeline. Obviously, I think this timeline has been adjusted a little bit because they are planning on, doing a lot of work in 2020. And as you already know, the COVID-19 kind of held everything back on a global scale. So the question that I would like to ask you all in the chat is, do you think incentivizing or encouraging an affordable housing overlay will work effectively? Why or why not? That will be great. Now I'm gonna allow Claudia to give her spiel on her work that she's done.
Thanks, Ronnie. So I know we have a limited amount of time with you all today, but we wanted to go through this briefing memo that I know Salt Lake City has been working on and is, working as actively as I can to try to get this mitigation of residential housing loss operational. Some of the key components of the memo that I was able to review is basically that it is to mitigate the loss of housing stock due to new non-residential development. And this is by requiring a mitigation plan from each developer that's involved. And through this, it has to be approved through the civil enforcement manager, which recently replaced the planning director. And some of the priorities of this plan is to require those unit losses to be replaced either one of two ways, through having housing in the same or nearby district, or replacing it in an area with a higher opportunity index score. Or if they're not willing to go that route, they must pay a fee kind of based on the housing loss, housing value loss of the site in question. And then another major component of this is obviously having these developers provide a housing impact statement, which describes the adverse effects and impacts of the project to the area, getting into more details in terms of the addresses of demolition sites, what are the fair market values, the square feet used, and then also introducing a detailed introduction to the plan. So some of the concerns around these revisions have kind of emerged surrounding the lack of accountability to set replacement units at a set ratio, but then also, the perceptions of a civil enforcement staff and the Housing Advisory and Appeals Board plays an important role in kind of mitigating existing conditions related to housing loss already. So I know this is very broad overview, but we want to kind of get your thoughts on how the city can address concerns surrounding this perception of enforcement and how this in and of itself can be improved, so that way the housing mitigation plan is more operational. So we'll put that in the chat, and we hope to have some thoughts gathered. We have already seen a lot of good engagement so far. Going to the next slide. The second component that I was able to review was the Housing Loss Relocation Assistance Program. So this is primarily to help those that are in housing that is being closed and is owned by the city. So if the city goes in and deems, the specific units or area substandard or imminent dangers or hazardous, and they go ahead and close that, this program is set to assist those that are being displaced, and they are paired with relocation assistance, which includes consultation meetings with specific agencies within the area. I know Utah Community Action is one of the key players here. And then through that, they are given available apartment listings and set up visits. Transportation isn't always obligated from the agency, which I think is a key component here that maybe we can look into a little bit more. And then rental assistance is also part of the program. And the money, that appropriation is through the city council, but it can also be sought through reimbursement from the actual apartment owner. So the priorities here are specifically for those that are low or extremely low income. And then the buildings that are focused on in this program are those that have 4 or fewer units closed in connection to that legalization question. So this, a robust program for the most part in trying to connect those folks that are being displaced and directly, having agency support and connections to available listings and relocation assistance. So something that we want to explore more with you all is if this program could essentially be a standard, a template, or some kind of blueprint for private demolitions and evictions. So that way that relocation arm is more commonplace and accessible by more people. So that's something that we'd love to see more of. And I know we have one more on my slides here, which is if you want to go to the next one, perfect. It's the Demolition Ordinance. So some of the recent changes to the Demolition Ordinance, which happened just in the last year, include streamlining demolition for commercial and residential properties. And this has been done through primarily having clearer definitions about what a nuisance is or what a boarded up building is, and then removing some requirements and having to have a permitted replacement use already or a landscape plan or bond set in place before demolition. And then it also promotes the responsible reuse of existing housing. And then the character of established neighborhoods or having a building permit already set in place, those have not been cited in the updates. So I know that with this, the planning department has kind of proposed other mechanisms to counter some tear downs, specifically related to historical buildings and those that are within the national registry, but maybe not the local registry. Things like a 1-unit density bonus or a lot width maximum have been kind of suggested, but in and of itself, we want to kind of explore, like we have been throughout the rest of these components, how this disproportionate effect of some of these land use ordinance might come into play when you're looking at housing loss and mitigation of housing loss, and especially when it comes to the lengthy and sometimes very expensive process of demolitions. So how to kind of address those municipal service costs and have possibility of appropriate funding for purchasing of nuisance properties to be rehabilitated, that kind of thing. So we'd like you to kind of ponder, how can the city make demolitions thoughtfully and responsibly carried out to actually mitigate housing loss? I know it's a very big question, but we'd like to kind of get all your responses here, and that's why it's a little bit more open-ended. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass the time over to the next colleague, which I think is Travis.
Actually, no, it's me.
Corey.
No worries. All right. So I was responsible for a few documents. I'm just kind of going to lump together the first two here because they're pretty similar. There's a bit of an overlap. The first two were the Building Affordable in Salt Lake City and Affordable Residential Development Guide and the Affordable Housing Reference Guide. Both of these documents, there's not a ton of material really to review. They're basically purely referential documents with general resources that are available. In the case of the Building Affordable in Salt Lake City, it's aimed specifically at developers, mostly financing options. It breaks it down from different levels. Basically, there's federal resources, state resources, county, city, and local resources. And then the Affordable Housing Reference Guide goes into more detail into what's available for homeowners, renters, and those who are in transitional housing situations, or those that are homeless individuals. So yeah, they're great resources just to get an idea of what's out there and what's available in the city locally for those different groups. But moving on to the consolidated plan, just to generally summarize the document really quick. The plan seeks to optimize fund allocations for the city of Salt Lake, specifically for the Community Development Block Grant Fund, Emergency Solutions Grant, Home Investment Partnership Program, and the Housing Opportunity for Persons with AIDS, or HOPWA. In line with the logic of optimization, the plan heavily focuses on the vulnerable populations of the city and tries to focus the plan on these groups, and as a byproduct, the block grants as well. Basically, with the plan, it culminates pretty substantial stakeholder and community outreach, along with some in-house analysis and market analysis that they do in order to culminate their strategic 5-year plan, which rounds out the document. From there, basically estimations for how much money is expected from each grant is outlined, as well as where they can expect to place the funds. In order to optimize the allocation of those grants, they created a geographic zone within Salt Lake City and designated which funds would be focused and allocated there more heavily in order to leverage grants and maximize their benefits. The zone tries to correspond as much as possible with poor areas of the city or those that have the lowest measured opportunity index scores, and aligns with existing redevelopment agency project areas. They designated the zone as the West Side target area, and the goal of the zone, again, is just to encourage and stimulate comprehensive neighborhood revitalization that expands housing and economic opportunities and neighborhood livability. The rationale for allocating those funds geographically, again, just it goes back to trying to leverage and maximize those grants. They figured that the best way to do so was to basically try to align those RDA areas with the designated zone in order to maximize those resources. So yeah, the consolidated plan is great. It's an excellent document to look at to see how the city is trying to maximize the effectiveness of its resources through targeted application. And yeah, it's basically just utilizing the funds that we have in order to better provide for those vulnerable populations in the city. It gives great insight into how they plan to increase the affordable housing stock and also target some of the other social and economic factors that are commonly connected with displacement as well. And if I had a question just off the top of my head, it's just since we're kind of in the middle of this now, I'm really curious to see if anybody has any insight onto how effective this geographic focus has been, if there's any noticeable leverage of funds that is really taken place there in that zone that you can see on the slide there for the consolidated plan. But yeah, that's all I've got, so I'll pass it off to Travis.
Yeah, thanks. So I wanted to start off by noting that as I'm the presentation caboose, I fear I'm not wanting to be iteratively not useful. So I'm going to attempt to provide information that I hope is not what do you call that one? Like, palindrome. It's like inversely redundant. So I wanted to mention something. One, that the slides that I built last night aren't uploaded, so you'll have to bear with me here. In referencing the RDA, I wanted to bring up a report I came across that says using a spatial equilibrium model and metadata from approximately 220 metropolitan areas, researchers recently found that spatial misallocation, which is believed to be caused by imposing restrictions to new housing supply, has potentially, which I was reading as effectively, stifled US aggregate growth by 36%. So let me note that the years in question were doubling. There was from 64 to 2009. So with the GDP in the US at 2009 sitting at $14.5 trillion, quantifying the significance of the said misallocation, the researchers report an 8.9% deficiency. That's implying an aggregate income of loss of $1.95 trillion simply because cities are making it too hard and too expensive for people to move into. And with tech-heavy cities such as San Francisco and San Jose being cited, it wasn't hard for me to draw the the correlation to Salt Lake City and Silicon Slopes. So armed with their mission, the RDA, I'm going to quote here, says, is to improve livability, foster authentic communities, and spark economic growth. So for me, the way that I was reading that is like, the import of this context helps shed the illusion of what I was calling like fiscal myopia, in the sense of that Salt Lake City's redevelopment agency has since dedicated over $70 million to affordable housing in Salt Lake City. And they've done so through a variety of mechanisms. And I wanted to go over those with you guys. One is providing construction and acquisition loans to serve as gap financing. And the second is acquiring, assembling, and preparing a property for future affordable housing development. The third is reselling a property at a discount for affordable housing development. Over the years, I had a slide here that the RDA had posted, and it seemed to draw a conclusion that the rate at which the allocation of funds occurs seems to be strongly correlated to the creation of the overseeing policies. So, for example, effectively, it could be understood that as like a removal of like red tape. For example, on the 12th of June, I think this is coming from 2018, the board adopted a resolution called the 17-2018. It's the Affordable Housing Notice of Funding Availability. And they mentioned that they were allocating then at that time $4 million. And you'll see like a spike in the rate that development is being done. It just seems to correlate with every policy that is being made. It just makes it easier for people to get things done, which is probably self-evident. But one of the things that they had mentioned that I thought was interesting is that they went ahead and defined what the revitalization priorities were as to include residential units targeted specifically to underserved populations. The units need to be located within walking distance of a transit stop or station. And 3 was to mitigate the displacement of existing affordable housing units. 4, encourage equitable geographic distribution of affordable housing, which we've already gone over, and provide long-term affordability.
So we also look at the mayor's like 2021 plan, and there's like all these different aid strategies that the city is doing, including like supporting the RDA strategic use of financial tools to create, again, affordable housing, as like Travis said, in places that are like walkable and places that are also in need of economic development. And I will just go to the next one, which is Travis. Also, we're looking at the equity plan, and there was like not much to look at here because this plan is like currently being created. So that they're right now doing the community engagement process. They're looking at city affairs, thinking about the climate of diversity within the Salt Lake City as a corporation, and then also looking at policies and ordinances. So it'd be great if there was like some overlap between the creation of the gentrification assessment mitigation plan with the equity plan, so those plans can actually like speak to each other. So the question is related to that. To do like a survey real quick. So this is like looking at all the strategies that everybody just presented, and look at the potential for preventing displacement. So there's a link that Carrie will be putting in there.
But the point is that we will take together all the feedback we've gotten today, and we'll get over the few coming days, and we'll pull it all together with the survey results into slides that will show how, what the city is currently doing, how those actions are being evaluated by you, and what are the shortcomings to address, or potentially what they're doing well, right?
Yeah, and here we see, at least in this one, that the affordable housing overlay seems to have like a lot of potential to prevent displacement, as well as the MMF 30 and
shared housing.
Yeah, also shared housing.
So basically, this is just sort of a template to show you what we're going after. So we want to list all the measures in separate categories, what they are, provide a short description, then show the assessment. Here I put both how assessment according to how the measure can prevent displacement and produce a sufficient affordable housing. We can go with one, we can go with two, we can discuss later depending on how much feedback we have from you, hopefully a lot. And then in the last column, we'll place comments. So once we're done with these, we'll post them and we'll send you the link. And now I'm gonna give the floor to Gloria.
Thank you, Justina. I think this is a great segue into some of the resources that we've been reviewing on top of kind of the localized current existing conditions and how land use practices are employed in the Salt Lake area. We've been trying to also think ahead and figure out what are some frameworks in analyzing policy that really focuses on displacement risk and opportunity access. And again, this is kind of a taste into this next phase of the project and hopefully a way to adopt an anti-displacement mindset and how we further, apply ordinances and land use practices into the future. So this specific framework is more about kind of asking those internal questions and establishing accountability measures throughout the process of, rezoning or just kind of reviewing and assessing current practices to see how and if they are benefiting communities in the way that we want to. So this is something that's adapted from the Puget Sound Regional Council and Seattle's 2035 Growth and Equity Plan. And what they both have in common is that it is approaching displacement with an intersectional lens. And it considers, the different causes of displacement, whether that's, building conditions, costs rising, and then it also, brings to mind the question of who gets affected the most. So are they communities of color? Are they renters at higher risk? What kind of, geographic scope can we apply? So we hope that this is an analysis that of the various characteristics that we can hopefully plug in. And I think I saw a few comments already discussing some current tools that maybe we can look into a little bit more specifically through, I think it was David Driscoll that had shared. But just to kind of run you through exactly what this process could look like, asking that initial question of who gets affected, what are some of the historical demographic trends of the target area that you're looking at, and how has the policy hurt or benefited certain groups and concentrated groups in a positive or negative light. And then from there, assessing the current climate, evaluating existing conditions, something that, we've already kind of engaged in and that I'm sure you're all are familiar with, but we do want to, introduce some of these indicators of displacement risk. And right now we're primarily focusing on those experiencing involuntary displacement. So our low income, below 60% AMI communities, and then within that disaggregate information based on the intersections of race, ethnicity, disability, and then also other social vulnerabilities. So, and then access to opportunity is, again, all these different, assets to the community, whether they are, access to transit, employment, core businesses and civic infrastructure like libraries and higher education institutions. So what is the proximity right now for certain communities that are experiencing more displacement risk, and how is that affecting their access to opportunities to thrive in all these different areas? And then from there, maybe introducing more ways to anticipate positive and negative impacts. Again, like I was kind of mentioning, where are the concentration of resources? And I think this also comes to play when we talk about, our underserved communities, and that also, I think, requires us to think about overserved communities and what is that kind of redistributive resource and justice that we want to be more aware of. And then the next two sections, having some impact statements similar to one of the housing mitigation loss briefing memos that mentioned having a housing impact mitigation statement. So with this, having something on paper and documented that explains desired outcomes through that equity impact lens. And then also using language similar to what Francisca was saying that doesn't otherize and that continues to build on the sense of needing to empower. And then finally, some kind of accountability oriented action plans. So proposing something that's long-term or kind of just dependent on what it is that you're looking at. What is the best timeline and life and vision of the particular thing that you're trying to address in terms of policy, and then what touch points can be embedded throughout the process to make sure that you're staying connected with communities, and that, you know, the information that you have internally, whether it's the planning department or the civil enforcement office, you know, how is it that you can kind of ground truth to the data that you have available to you? So if you go to the next slide, we kind of just presented a taste of how this policy analysis can be applied to, you know, a current ordinance. And what you see here are more reflective questions. Just, you know, as like I said, we are kind of exploring these as different pathways, and hopefully get your feedback on if this is a good direction. We hope that this kind of mindset informs the outcome of our projects. And, you know, going through these sections again, when we ask, you know, who gets affected, we, in the context of this, you know, Salt Lake City Demolition Ordinance, maybe we would ask ourselves, will it displace someone living in or even just near the area? What's the impact that's kind of surrounding and repercussive to the area? And what health impacts or intersectional experiences are going to come about because of this policy implementation? And then from there, assessing, you know, existing conditions through displacement risks, you know, what concentrations of race, disability, or other social vulnerabilities are surfacing because of this implementation. And then the access to opportunity component, you know, is it going to take away from any of these opportunity assets, like will impact things like school performance, access to employment and transit centers? What's the situation with food stability, or even just, you know, putting into mind things related to mental health? And I know with COVID-19, it's something that really shocked our systems, and trying to be more proactive going into this next section of anticipating those positive and negative impacts, and asking ourselves, you know, is there enough incentive to supplement affordable housing units that are high in density, you know, if this demolition goes through? What support is there for developers and able to complete the demolition in an appropriate manner if it does have something to do with the boarded up building that is a health risk? And then into the next couple sections, how can the city strive for more sustainable demolition practices? What does that mean for each community? And what structures are in place to better guarantee housing replacement ratios that can be consistent? And then finally, with an accountability oriented action plan, perhaps this is something like mapping out the key players that are required to see an equity adjusted ordinance through. What are these accountability measures? And again, that final question of how can you stay connected with the community and inform them throughout the process? So as we wrap up, this next slide that you'll see is something we want to leave you with, that based on our research and kind of our literature review, essentially, of all these different ordinances. And I know we've thrown a lot at you, but we hope that this take on anti-displacement mindsets to advance housing equity kind of reminds you of the core mission of a project like this. And this specific framework that I'm presenting to you here has been operationalized in places like Vancouver, which you see here, it was kind of adapted from, and it resembles elements of other major cities that are tackling similar exclusionary zoning practices, such as Salt Lake City, which is experiencing a lot of growth and also housing challenges in terms of affordability. So first, we want to make sure that we foster opportunity through bolstering residents' current and future abilities to obtain, retain, and improve their socioeconomic and housing situation. So thinking, you know, generations into the future, understanding that the issues that we're facing right now are intergenerational, and trying to apply as systemic solutions as we can to as systemic issues that we have presented to us. And then practice redistributive justice. And what we mean by redistributive justice is being mindful of the fact that you know, we need to identify and recommend strategies that are about transforming systems, and that to do that, it means, you know, being power mindful, and, you know, where is power being held right now, and who is currently being disenfranchised and using that power. I think it was Valerie that mentioned in the chat a couple of things about you know, tenants and landlords, what relationships are there, and how is that benefiting or putting in danger, you know, housing stability for certain folks. And I think this also, like I said, requires being aware of underserved communities, but also those that are overserved. What areas need to have that balance of resources, and be more mindful of who has access to them and who hasn't had access for you know, many years. And the third component is instituting accountability. So measures that, you know, the key players within our city government and developers and community residents and stakeholders are able to come together and reach intended outcomes, and also the dissemination of those results, so that those that are actually going to experience the end of these policies are able to benefit from them. And then finally, we hope to, have community voices be a key pillar of our recommendation review, since this is really where the ground truthing happens and local concerns can meet final kind of policy impact. So I'll leave you all with that, and thank you for your time and consideration and all the work that you are doing to inform action and policy. And we hope that we'll go into more detail in our recommendations portion of this next project phase. And then hopefully we will definitely keep in mind all the different comments that you've made so far and use that to inform the best practices that we come up with in the end. So thank you.